A different perspective now from Marta Foresti. She is the director of the Human Mobility Initiative at the Overseas Development Institute and a visiting senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. She spoke to us from London. I want to ask you first, with the historic level of movement of people across the globe now, how do you think we need to change the way we consider that global movement, the way we think about refugees and asylum seekers and migrants?
We need indeed to rethink the way we use our language and the labels you use. These labels exist for good reasons. There are some individuals on the move that are entitled to international protection and international law because they flee persecution and violence. When they claim asylum in a country that has signed a 1951 Convention on Refugees, they become asylum seekers, and then they may well be granted the status of refugees. And much has been said about the importance of recognizing the difference between refugees and migrants. There are two problems, however, with the use of labels and categories, which I see. The first is that increasingly, in the global movement of people, there are human beings that don't fit neatly into these categories. Let me give you a couple of examples. Think of someone who's fleeing their home because of a natural disaster, a flood, a drought, and are therefore in need of protection, are vulnerable, have lost all their belongings. Now, at the moment, today, those individuals do not qualify for refugee status and therefore fall between the cracks of international laws in this definition. Another example is what we've seen on migrants in being very vulnerable in, say, detention center in Libya. So these may well be individuals who have left their countries of origins willingly in search of economic opportunities, but become very vulnerable and victims of abuse during their journeys or as a result of being detained in Libya. So these are all cases of individuals that are not easy to label one way or the other. And in practice, this means that the migration flows that we experience are mixed. So there are, on the boats that cross the Mediterranean or on the caravans that get across Mexico, there are likely to be different individuals in different circumstances. And therefore, it's not good enough, or it's simply not enough to label them accurately to address their needs and their rights adequately. The other and final problem I see is that this has created a bit of a political hot potato, meaning that politicians are happy to refer to refugees as being deserving and in need of protection, but on the other hand have increasingly become, we've heard an increasingly negative rhetoric around the term migrant. So today, if somebody is called a migrant, it implies has a very negative connotation. And so we risk focusing our attention and the protection on certain individuals at the expense of others, which I believe to be highly problematic and simply not very effective at finding pragmatic ways of managing the reality of these mixed flows around the globe.
You've touched on some of the reasons that people move or leave their homes, but I also know that you've done some work in this particular area. What is it that we really need to know about that, about why people actually move?
So you're right. We have done at ODI some research into what drives people to move, and others have done the same. And the good news is that we know pretty well today what are the variety of reasons of different forms of migration, ranging from those who are related to economic opportunities and those who are related to people fleeing violence and prosecution. What we have found and others have found is that in practice a lot of those reasons are mixed again. So people who flee their countries under severe conditions of violence and abuse still have aspirations and still go in search of opportunities for themselves and for their families. So it is often a combination of reasons why people migrate. And importantly, once people are on the move, and as we know, people tend to move in neighboring countries and regionally before they attempt longer and more dangerous journeys, the opportunities that are provided to people to fulfill these aspirations, education for their children, quality, decent work, for themselves and their families is what really matters and affects the decisions that people make in relation to their migration journeys and migration choices. And in my view, it would be very important that as policies are devised and designed to try to address the reality of migration, that we took those aspirations and those realities of what human beings search for into account, whether they originally moved voluntarily or not, and recognize the humanity that is common to those who are on the move in relation to their aspiration and hopes, their skills, their capacities.
The politics of this, of course, is fraught, and it's certainly been highlighted in the United States recently with this caravan moving from Central America through Mexico. Europe has been dealing with this for some time now, and of course we've got huge migrations in Africa as well. But specifically, I want to ask you about Europe and what lessons we might learn among Western governments from the experience that Europe has had in terms of the politics of the situation.
So there are a number of lessons to be learned from Europe and from also some recent examples in the United States and the recent campaign around the midterm elections. The first thing to learn is that ignoring the concerns and worries that voters and citizens have in Europe and elsewhere around migration when it's not well managed is something that politicians ignore at their peril. So we've seen that politicians that have made the choice to create negative narratives and fuel the scaremongery around migration, like President Trump has recently done around the caravan from Honduras, is definitely, politically has been a tactic that has paid off. And those politicians that have not paid attention to the anxieties that people have around migration that is not well managed have paid their price. A good example in Europe is, of course, Angela Merkel, and we've seen in countries like Italy and elsewhere the political victory that the negative narrative around migration has resulted into. Now, what is important, though, is to pay attention to the fact that time and time again, the opinion surveys, they track public attitudes to refugees and migrants. And again, this is something where at ODI we've done some research, signal that individuals in Europe and elsewhere do not have particularly strong views against migrants and refugees. People have concerns around the fact that the borders may not be controlled, that there may be lack of clarity about the rules under which people are allowed or not into a country, and they've been certainly affected by the images of real or metaphorical of invasions and of people coming with no control into European countries, and have expressed those anxieties in the ballot box. But in reality, the research suggests that people do not hold particularly negative views and attitudes towards refugees and migrants. And we've seen in this country, in the UK, last year, the outrage in the so-called Windrush scandal, where people felt strongly that migrants that had made a significant contribution to this country and have indeed acquired the right to be in this country were mistreated by the government. So it's important in the future, and for those policymakers and politicians that will in the future take the stage in Europe and elsewhere, to really understand this reality, this opening, the fact that people do not have negative views, and pay attention to their anxieties and to their concerns, and devise realistic policies aimed at better manage the reality of migration rather than fuel the scaremongering and the crisis rhetoric that we heard so commonly in Europe and elsewhere.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you about the Global Compact on Migration, the United Nations effort to try and come up with, I suppose, a broader approach to this worldwide phenomenon. What difference do you think it'll actually make, given that the United States and other countries basically have said they don't want to be a part of it?
In my opinion, the Global Compact for Migration that will be adopted in Morocco in a few weeks' time is a significant step in the right direction in better managing global migration. As you said, the US, about a year ago, at the very beginning of the negotiation, pulled out, and most recently, at the end of the negotiations, a number of European countries have done the same. And in all cases, they've done They have decided to do so, claiming the primacy of domestic politics and the importance of sovereignty of member states to decide for themselves when it comes to their immigration policies and their border management. Now, what is important to understand about this Global Compact for Migration is that it does not take in any way away from any country the power, the sovereign power, to make decisions about its immigration policies. But it does recognize that global migration being by definition a phenomenon where an individual crosses a border and so travels from one country to another and often across multiple countries, that requires some forms of international cooperation. So it requires states to come to agreements, whether bilaterally, regionally, in groups, to manage the reality of this phenomena in pragmatic ways. So from that perspective, having a global platform, a global agreement where the vast majority of member states agree in principle to take collective action towards first understanding and then addressing the reality of migration is a positive step forward. Whether we'll make a difference in practice will depend on what member states will actually do with it. It's a non-binding agreement, which means that there is no sticks and there are no carrots for delivering on the commitments that the Compact, the 23 commitments the Compact has. But it does create an opportunity for those states that are willing to use it as a platform for action. And the reality is that in some countries it will make very little difference. Countries where there is no political appetite to take significant steps towards better management of migration. But for example, in a number of countries in Latin America, where there is a tradition and an understanding of the importance of regional cooperation to handle the movement across countries, a number of countries are already taking very proactive steps to use the Compact as a framework for action. Similarly, in a number of African states, that is happening. And my hope is that as Europe has come to a bit of a standstill in terms of its own European Union policies and framework to come to an agreement across the whole of the member states, that the Global Compact will provide a platform and a framework for those states in Europe that are willing to take some proactive action. I'm thinking, for example, of some of the statements that President Macron made last week in Paris, that the presence, the existence of this global agreement will give both an inspiration and opportunity for action in a number of different countries.
Ms. Foresti, thank you very much for your expertise on this.
Thank you very much for having me.